Welcome to Vinnie Politan Investigates. I'm Julia Jenaé, filling in for Vinnie Politan tonight. And we are taking a closer look at the case of 4 University of Idaho students who were killed in their sleep. A case that has drawn so many questions from the public, from family members, and now we're getting more answers post a sentencing of the killer. Here's the story. In the early morning hours of November 13th, 2022, a brutal horror unfolded in the quiet college town of Moscow, Idaho. 4 University of Idaho students, Kaylee Gonsalves, Madison Mogan, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, were savagely stabbed to death in their off-campus home. And the man arrested and charged was Bryan Kohberger, who had studied criminology in grad school. Prosecutors said they accumulated a significant amount of evidence, including DNA, cell phone records, surveillance video, and a knife sheath. Prosecutors wanted the death penalty, but ultimately, in a move that shocked many, they reached a deal with Kohberger, a deal that kept capital punishment off the table, sparing the life of this quadruple murderer. At his sentencing hearing, family members of the victims didn't hold back, bearing their grief, pain, and disgust with the defendant. Just hours after Kohberger's multiple life sentences were made official, investigators released a mountain of information, new insight into how the atrocity played out and what they learned about Kohberger's movements. The family members of those 4 students, they've been asking for questions from the very beginning. And some have even reported that they weren't kept abreast of some of the things that were happening behind the scenes. But now we do have more, and that's after we had an emotional sentencing hearing with all of those family and friends in one place. Here's a listen back to 2 of those surviving roommates, plus the father of one of the victims.
I was so frantic that morning and scared to death, not knowing what had happened. And when I made the 911 call, I couldn't even get out the words. That was the worst day of my life. Xana was 1 in a million. She was the life of the party, but she was also the kindest and funniest person I knew. Kaylee had the most beautiful, radiant smile. She was so kind, but also one of the funniest people I've ever known. I really believed that she could have ruled the world if she wanted to, and she would have been America's sweetheart. Ethan was the sweetest, most genuine guy. He was always smiling and always making other people smile too. Maddie was not only one of my best friends, but she was the older sister I would have always wanted.
He is a hollow vessel, something less than human.
We are done being victims. We are taking back our lives.
And it's because of that final sentencing in this plea deal arrangement that now we get the documents that we have. Police can no longer say it's an ongoing investigation because now it is fully closed. So what do these new documents reveal? And that gets us to the first question in our investigation. What are we learning about the crime scene? And let's bring in our guests. Our panel is going to help us get through the details of all of these hundreds of documents that we have. We have former homicide detective Chris McDonough. He spent a lot of time at the Idaho crime scene. He's also the host of The Interview Room with Chris McDonough. We also have board-certified forensic pathologist Dr. Priya Banerjee with us, who has done a host of autopsies. And I want to read for you some of what we're learning from the autopsies. This is newly released information, and it goes through these 4 different victims, and there are some variances. So take a look. We've got first Ethan Chapin. And it said that his fatal injury was a stab wound under his left clavicle. The wound severed his jugular vein, his subclavian artery, and Chapin only had sharp force injuries, that's noted. Xana Kernodle, her fatal injuries were a laceration in the right lung and heart. She had over 50 stab wounds, mostly defensive. She had only sharp force injuries. And then moving to Madison Mogan, fatal injuries for her were lacerations to her left lung and liver. She had only sharp force injuries. Kaylee Gonsalves, over 20 stab wounds, sharp force injuries, asphyxial injuries, blunt force injuries. Fatal injuries included lacerations in left lung and liver, subdural bleeds, stab behind her clavicle that cut her subclavian vein and artery. Dr. Banerjee, hearing all of this, what is standing out to you now that we have the autopsy?
Just heartbreaking. I listened to the parents yesterday, and as a parent myself, who wants to hear this detailed? I hope it provides closure. It's extremely violent. Any stabbing is up close and personal, but you know these kids fought back. You know, when we say defensive wounds, that can be anywhere. Usually we look at the hands, the forearms, sometimes even the legs. So, you know, that's not giving up easily. These are healthy kids who are just in their bedrooms. And you can see that all of them bled to death, you know, because of the injuries to either big blood vessels like arteries or veins, or the heart, the liver, the lungs. So unfortunately, that's not instantaneous. And that's what breaks my heart the most, is that it'll be seconds to minutes, but it's not going to be instant. So, you know, I hope that the stress of it, they bled out quickly and didn't feel a lot of pain.
Chris, what are you seeing when you look at this crime scene? And I want to read something from one of the police reports from an investigating officer who was first on scene. He said that Kaylee's face was completely disfigured and stabbed several times, and he was unable to comprehend exactly what he was looking at while trying to discern the nature of these injuries. And he just highlighted that he couldn't even recognize the victim. Your thoughts there?
Yeah, Julia, and if we take that to when the first officers got on the scene, the first place they went to was that second floor where they discover Ethan and Xana. And in that particular room, you know, they see a tremendous amount of blood evidence, cast-off evidence. And when you think about what the medical examiner just said a moment ago, 50-plus wounds, the majority of those being defensive wounds, every time that knife struck these children, there was a cast-off from that particular weapon. And then, of course, Ethan, there was what they call arterial spray. That means once, you know, a main artery is cut, every time the heart beats, that blood is going to disperse from the body. And then you take it from there and go to the third floor where they find Maddie and Kaylee. And Kaylee is completely unrecognizable. And there's what they call layover cast off. So that means both girls were fighting simultaneously.
Dr. Banerjee, that part of it, the unrecognizable, is that something that from a coroner or an autopsy standpoint, that there may be something added in terms of what it seems like happened there with that victim versus the other victims, because we didn't see those specific words in any other autopsy for the other three victims?
Right. It seemed like other wounds were more clustered to the body, the torso, if you will, from the neck down. I don't know why her face was so targeted. Again, it's very personal. Anytime I think about disfigurement with violence, that's highly charged and very personal, very antagonistic. So I don't know if she just fought back more or he had a vendetta against her. Specifically, you know, I think that gets to the underlying motive that to me is unclear. But nonetheless, if she even screamed back at him and said, you know, nasty things, potentially that's a way of, you know, getting her to not speak, really get at, you know, her person. You know, it's not just a other part of her body that's substantive to who she is.
Yeah, it's revealing so much. And I do want to ask you, Chris, about another portion of the police report, if we can put that back up on the screen. And this is, again, that initial responding officer saying that they were assigned to hold security at the rear slider door of this apartment, this building. And this was the alleged point of entry of the suspect. And they observed very large footprints in the snow. This happened in November of 2022. They used a tape measure, and the shoe size measured approximately 13.5 to 14 inches. The footstep went to and from the rear slider door. I observed the trail of footsteps head away from the slider and then turn right around a stump in the backyard and lead towards the front of the house. There was also a discarded black backpack in the backyard. Chris, what's standing out to you?
Well, You know, there's two things. One, obviously, that backpack is extremely interesting. You know, we don't know if that was what we would call a kill kit, potentially. I haven't seen documentation that would, you know, point that out exactly. But so that's a speculation. But it does potentially give us a direction of travel. Because remember, Dylan, one of the eyewitnesses, sees the subject leave that back patio door. And so it could be related to the suspect. But at this point, the documents aren't necessarily clear enough telling us that's exactly what was taking place.
Yeah, the documents answer some questions and then they create more. Dr. Banerjee and Chris McDonald, stand by. We do have a lot more to get to. Here's what's coming up next. We're going to take a look at how did police investigate Kohberger's alibi.
You failed. Instead, your actions have united everyone in their disgust for you.
Matriarch of the Adelson family gets arrested. Terrible.
Donna Adelson is facing charges of murder, the death of her former son-in-law, Dan Markell.
Prosecutors say a bitter child custody battle was the motive for the murder-for-hire plot.
Now that Donna has turned into a defendant, what's next for the Adelson clan?
Now that the ship is really sinking fast, blood doesn't matter that much.
The Matriarch Mastermind murder trial. Live coverage begins this August on Court TV.
Today we are here to prove to the world that you picked the wrong families. The wrong state, the wrong police officers, the wrong community. You tried to break our community apart. You tried to plant fear. You tried to divide us. You failed. Instead, your actions have united everyone in their disgust for you. I just learned from these lead investigators, to their shock, they worked in an investigation and actually worked with Pennsylvania police officers and the federal FBI. You united everyone. Everyone was united after you.
Welcome back to Vinnie Politan Investigates. We are continuing our investigation into the aftermath of the brutal killing of 4 University of Idaho students. Now, when there is an investigation and law enforcement officers are on the case, that doesn't mean that the investigation stops after an arrest of the suspect. We know Bryan Kohberger was taken into custody at the end of 2022, but these investigators had to continue with this case, mainly because it's at that point that a defense team goes to work and they start looking into whether there are alternate theories or alternate suspects. And there was an example of that with Bryan Kohberger's defense. In 2024, 2 years after this happened, he filed a notice of alibi. Take a look. This is what was filed by his defense team, where they said that he was somewhere else, could not have committed these murders. They said that Mr. Kohberger was out driving in the early morning hours of November 13th, 2022, as he often did to hike and run and see the moon and stars. He drove throughout the area south of Pullman, Washington, west of Moscow, Idaho, including Wawa Park. So that brings us to the next question in our investigation. How did police investigate Kohberger's alibi? And we have joining us to let us know the details about this alibi. Court TV field reporter Cody Thomas is here with us tonight. And Cody, you were in Idaho last year, I believe. You followed Kohberger's previous alibi because at that point, he was still innocent until proven guilty.
That's absolutely right, Julia. I drove the route down to Hawaii County Park out in Idaho. That's the location where Kohberger previously claimed he was at during the time of the murders. Now, of course, I'm not from Western Idaho, but to me, it was an odd location to be at 4 in the morning. You had to take this gravel road for a good 5 to 7 miles off the main road down into what seemed to be some sort of valley between these rolling hills. And I made it right up to the gate of the park. Take a look. According to Bryan Kohberger's alibi, he says during the window of time that the murders occurred, he was out driving around simply stargazing, specifically ending up right here at what he calls one of his favorite parks in his alibi, Hawaii County Park. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong with coming to a public park, you know, doing what you want to do, stargazing included. That's what they're here for people's leisure in the community. But one caveat about this park in particular, it closes once the sun goes down and doesn't reopen until 7 a.m. And if you pan over here to the left, it's gated, and that gate is closed. No cars coming in, no cars coming out. So according to Bryan Kohberger's alibi, he says he was here during the window of time that the murders occurred. Now, we know those murders occurred between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. Now, how is it that he could be out here at those times if this park is closed? Not to say his alibi is untruthful, but it does get a little muddy once you throw that crucial piece of information in here about Hawaii County Park. And Julia, of course, we now know that this alibi was all made up with Kohberger now being a convicted killer of those 4 Idaho students. But also in this massive dump of newly released documents that we've been looking through related to the case, police say in July of 2024, they accessed the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's website and confirmed down to the exact time on the day of the murders between 4 and 4:25 in the morning that it was overcast with lots of cloud cover. So he could not have been stargazing in the first place. And Julia, also, we now know from the documents that in December of 2024, police spoke with a park ranger from Hawaii County Park. Now, this ranger was asked whether they'd seen a white Elantra, Kohberger's car, around the time of the homicides 2 years prior. According to the documents, that ranger did not recall anything suspicious, and he said that he typically closed the gate to the park at night, but did not lock it. Now, the documents also state that no security cameras that were present could help them with the investigation, Julia.
Cody Thomas, thank you for that report. Let's bring in our panel of guests to help us break this down. We have retired FBI agent Stuart Fillmore with us and journalist Howard Bloom. He's also the author of When the Night Comes Falling, a requiem for the Idaho student murders, out now in paperback with a brand new afterword. Stuart, let me start with you. We're talking about what happens 2 years after the arrest of Bryan Kohberger, after these homicides. What's the challenge when you are a detective and you get this filing by the defense that hadn't come out at any point before that?
Yeah, one of the things would be you're going to try to look for surveillance cameras, and we know that that's one of the things that placed him at the scene of the crime, or very near there, leaving at 4:20. But so that's one of the things. But unfortunately, if you have that time lag, a lot of that footage is going to be gone. I think they were able to actually locate him on a few cameras coming back into Pullman. But that would be the one thing that jumps out to me that would be a real impediment getting the information that late.
Yeah, how often, and follow up, Stuart, how often does that happen, that even years into an investigation, the defense team files something and it causes police to have to go scrambling to see if they can debunk it or see if it has any credibility?
Well, it's not going to be that uncommon because the defense is, I guess, creative might be the word, thinking of things that they can, weaknesses in the case. And so I wouldn't be that surprised that kind of stuff happens. And surely, you as an investigator, you want to get to the ultimate truth of everything. So, yeah, you're going to run down everything you can, no matter when it comes in.
Howard, what's your take on how they investigated this particular alibi?
Well, Corporal Brett Payne said early on in the investigation what caught his attention was the fact that Kohberger's phone was turned off. It was turned off at, I think, 2:46 to 4:28, just the times when the murders occurred. And that was, in a way, like the Sherlock Holmes story of the dog that didn't bark. And that Payne said that this was an indication to him that Kohberger was up to something. He purposely turned off his phone just at the time when the murders occurred. They presented this alibi to the court, and Judge Hippler said, this is not an alibi. This was the weakest link in their case. This is when I think the defense realized they were really up against it because they took a 9-month period to put together this alibi. They had their client in jail. If they had something that was valid, they'd been screaming it from the rooftops from day one. But this was the best they could come up with. It was, it just had no future, this alibi defense.
Howard, you've looked into this case, you've investigated it in terms of the writing of your book, and we know in the victim impact statements that were so emotional in the sentencing hearing, a lot of these family members took the time to remind Bryan Kohberger that he was not the criminal mastermind that he perhaps thinks he is. What do you think are some of the biggest missteps he made that let him play right into the hands of police?
Well, the largest misstep, of course, was his leaving the knife sheath behind. That knife sheath had touch DNA on it. One could, though, then make the case. If they did not have this bit of touch DNA, would they have ever gotten Kohberger? It was this bit of touch DNA that allowed the FBI to identify him, to give what they called a tip to the Moscow task force. This tip led them to identify Kohberger as living 9 miles away, led to the cell phone triangulation, led to the photographs of the white car going through the murder scene, and the fact that he had ordered a knife, a K-bar knife from Amazon. But if they did not have this DNA, it might have been the perfect crime because there was no blood evidence in the house. There was no blood evidence in his apartment. They couldn't find any blood evidence in his car. Without the knife sheath, it would not have been a case.
Stuart, you're a former FBI agent. Do you think the FBI is going to continue looking into whether there was any other open case out there that may be connected to Bryan Kohberger?
You know, if there is some predicate for that, I haven't heard it, but certainly it's something that you would not want to rule out, and you would certainly keep an open mind about that. You know, was this his first time, or did he? You know, is there something else out there that he had done? I think there was a pretty good look into his background and his timeline, but again, you never know, and keep that open mind because anything could be possible.
Stuart and Howard, thank you so much for that analysis. We're going to get to a break, but our guests are staying with us. We're going to talk about something else that's been newly revealed in this case. Here's the question. What was the second murder weapon? Welcome to Vinnie Politan Investigates. I'm Julia Jenaé, filling in for Vinnie Politan tonight as we continue to look closely at the aftermath of the University of Idaho students who were brutally killed in 2022. And their killer, Bryan Kohberger, stood in court saying nothing about what his motive was or any details about this horrific crime that gripped a community and the nation. Here's the story. Bryan Kohberger is now serving multiple life sentences for the brutal murders of 4 University of Idaho students, Kaylee Gonsalves, Madison Mogan, Xander Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. Investigators say they were stabbed early one cold November morning in 2022. The grim discovery led to a major criminal investigation in the quiet college town of Moscow. Prosecutors said strong evidence tied Kohberger to the crimes, and they wanted the death penalty. But before the trial, the two sides reached a deal, and guilty pleas eliminated the chance of a death sentence. After that, victims' family members let out their anger face-to-face in court with the defendant. And now investigators have released hundreds of new documents that give new information on what happened that tragic day. Family members of 3 of those 4 victims stood to face Bryan Kohberger inside of a courtroom for a sentencing hearing, giving emotional victim impact statements. But it's the family of Kaylee Gonsalves, her father, Steve, her mother, Christy, and her sister, Olivia, who shifted the dynamic inside of that courtroom as they turned the podium to look directly at Bryan Kohberger and ask the burning questions that so many of us have.
Where is the murder weapon? The clothes you wore that night? What did you bring into the house with you? What was the second weapon you used on Kaylee?
What was the other weapon? Despite this thing you've had in the past years, there still sounds like there's something we don't know.
No, we do know that another weapon was used on Kaylee. So we don't know what that weapon was, but
they didn't recover it.
Along with the knife was recovered, but Kaylee was not just stabbed. There was other things that happened to Kaylee.
So that brings us to another question in our investigation. And that's, what was the second murder weapon? This is really our first time hearing that there may have been something other than a knife used. So here to help answer that question is Chris McDonough and Stuart Fillmore still with us. Let's first take a look at exactly what we see in the autopsy report and the details about the injuries, because that's where we get this confirmation from authorities that there may have been a second weapon used, and it has to do with the injuries of Kaylee Gonsalves. It not only said that she was stabbed more than 20 times, but it also says that her sharp force injuries included asphyxial injuries, blunt force injuries. That's the key here. And her other fatal injuries included lacerations in the left lung and liver, subdural beads, a stab behind her clavicle that cut her subclavian vein and artery. But looking at the blunt force trauma, Stuart, what does that say to you when you hear that detail that we didn't quite have before in a case where the knife is such a focus?
Yeah, so my reading of that was that the face was completely unrecognizable, meaning it was just probably completely bashed in. You know, the K-bar is a heavy-bladed knife. It's got a thick guard on it. The guard is the component that separates the handle from the blade to keep the hand from sliding onto the blade. It's very possible that he was in a fit of rage, whatever his motivation. You know, it's possible that K-bar and the guard on it could have caused that blunt force. You know, without the specific description from the autopsy report or photos, it's kind of hard to say. We're only speculating. But the other thing, too, is it could just simply have been maybe he stabbed her and then just started beating her with his hand. I don't know that there was any, we know of any injuries to his hand that might cause on him. But you know, it's also possible, too, he did have another weapon, some kind of a stick, a nightstick, a baseball bat. I don't know. So it's very intriguing to see that Kaylee had the blunt force trauma.
Yeah, the family certainly wants to know what it is. Howard, is there anything that stands out to you as possible based on what we know about this case? Oh, Chris McDonough, I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. You know, one of the things that struck me is as they did a life, pattern about Bryan Kohberger, he wanted to be a police officer, right? Well, you ever heard of a tail light? We don't know if he had a light that evening. We definitely know he had the knife. But if he had a flashlight, a tail light is a very effective tool when you're hitting somebody. I've had many cases where flashlights were utilized to create the type of blunt force trauma that we're talking here. And one way to determine that is, again, to start back at the crime scene with the cast-off type of blood, because the more force that's used, and as the suspect is hitting the victim and the individual's coming up, the velocity of the blood that's coming off of that particular weapon will give you a clue in relationship to how much force is being used and potentially, the type of size of the weapon in of itself. But I agree with Stuart. The bottom of that K-bar is also in play here.
And another thing that kind of struck people as interesting is that after the sentencing, when officers were really open about everything that happened in terms of the Moscow Police Department, when they were asked directly by reporters what may have been the second murder weapon, they mentioned that you'll have to ask the families about that. Take a listen to what Steve Gonsalves said about Kaylee's injuries during that sentencing.
It was horrific what Kaylee went through. Yeah, and I don't want to protect this guy, but I won't give out all the details. I'll be general, but yeah, she was stabbed over 30 plus times, and she was struck, and there was quite a bit of damage to her face. So this guy's just an absolute monster. Anyone who thinks that he's otherwise, I just looked at pure demons out there. When I was looking at him, we had a stare down, and he's just filled with demons. He's dark pits of eyes. And there's something seriously wrong with that man.
Stuart, when you're hearing that and seeing how officers didn't want to reveal much more, What are your thoughts there on this type of injury?
Yeah, I'm really confused. It sounds like Steve knows more than what he's saying, and then the police. That's a very curious answer, especially at this point. I mean, what is there to hide about it? And honestly, Kaylee's wounds, again, they are so personal to the face and such destruction to the face. That to me hints possibly that maybe she was the target, or that there was just that there was so much anger that he directed at the face, and it's very personal. So yeah, I tell you, this is just another little mystery to this case that, man, I just don't see why we need to have at this point.
I want to ask you this, Chris, and it basically goes to this defendant and his background. Not only is he a criminology major, but he was also someone who applied for the internship program at the police department there in Moscow, Idaho. Before, when he was in Pennsylvania, he was a school officer, a resource officer there at a school. When you think about what he perhaps had aspirations of, I mean, it's almost chilling to think of what if he had been able to achieve the career that he wanted. How does that play into your analysis of this case?
You know, Julia, that's a great analysis in and of itself that you're talking about there, because basically what that tells us, we in the law enforcement arena, and Stuart and I would say this guy was what we would call a wannabe. Okay? And these types of individuals are looking for control, dominance, those types of things. They're weeded out pretty quickly through some of the interview processes that law enforcement goes through. But it would have been a very scary proposition had he not been flushed out through the interview process, I believe at Washington State University with the chief, as well as some of the other problems early on in his adolescence years.
Chris, I already asked Stuart this question, so I want to ask you, give you the opportunity to weigh in on it. We don't know. We haven't seen any evidence that there is anything else in Bryan Kohberger's past in terms of a criminal history. But would it be typical if something had come out during these last 2 to 3 years that police would not have revealed it, waiting on this case to come to a close? Do you think that he's connected to any other case, especially given the brutality of this case?
Yeah, I personally believe he is at some point. There's going to be, some smaller types of crimes early on in his life. Remember, he had a heroin addiction, and a lot of individuals have to support that particular habit through, small burglaries, that type of stuff. So it won't surprise me with some of the records that are sealed that it will reveal some, type of petty crimes, that kind of stuff. But he was on the path of elevation. There is no question about that. And his obsession with Ted Bundy as a perfect example, with him playing cosplay, dressing up in the hoodie, et cetera. My personal opinion is I'm going to be really surprised with what they found on his phone, the pornography, et cetera, if he doesn't also have some type of petty criminal past.
Stuart, do you think he's going to talk? Do you think we're ever going to hear from Bryan Kohberger, since at his sentencing he told the judge respectfully he declines to speak?
Yeah, I agree with Chris that I think he's fascinated by Bundy, and that he thinks he's so proud of himself. It's just too hard for him to hold this in. He wants the world to know what he did, because he's actually kind of proud of it. And I have a theory that I think that maybe this might have been him trying to recreate Bundy's attack on the Chi Omega house at Florida State University, and thought he could do it better than Bundy. But yeah, he's there's just no way he can hold this in. At some point he's got to let the world know how great he is.
Thanks so much to our guests for weighing in on this. We will continue to follow this case, but still to come, what did Bryan Kohberger bury?
There is no evidence that we found that would lead us to any specific, even general location as to where the murder weapon or the clothes have been, and we searched.
2 parents face a jury
over the attempted murder of their own daughter. Court TV takes you inside the trial that's torn a family apart.
The attempted honor killing trial. Live coverage continues Monday morning, only on Court TV.
Donna Adelson is facing charges of murder, the death of her former son-in-law.
Now that Donna has turned into a defendant, what's next for the Adelson clan?
The matriarch mastermind murder trial. Live coverage this August on Court TV.
There is no evidence that we found that would lead us to any specific, even general location as to where the murder weapon or the clothes have been. And we searched. I mean, the FBI, again, to their credit, we had folks doing soil samples and so all sorts of things to try to come up with somewhere to start searching for these things, and we just never found it. As far as the forensics piece, I'll let Darren speak to
Yeah, and on the weapon, it wasn't a lack of trying. You know, everywhere that we had evidence of where he went, based upon phone records, based upon the evidence that we had gathered, we searched that. We went there. We did searches on the ground, in the water. We did searches. We sent soil samples to try to figure out maybe where a shovel had been used. So we searched everywhere that we possibly could, but the reality is we're looking for a singular small, it's not that small, but K-bar knife, and that's it.
Welcome back to Vinnie Politan Investigates. New details continue to pour in on the heels of the sentencing of Bryan Kohberger for the murder of 4 University of Idaho students in 2022. We're getting to hear things that we simply didn't before. Detectives weren't permitted to talk about it, and now they have opened up hundreds of documents that previously could not be released. Now, before all of these documents, we knew the travel pattern of Bryan Kohberger. We knew that he was in Idaho, near Moscow, Idaho, during the time that these murders happened, and that he would have stayed there to complete his semester at grad school in nearby Pullman, Washington. And that for Christmas break, he would have traveled cross-country with his father inside of a white Elantra to Pennsylvania, where he's from, where he grew up. And it's there, 6 weeks after these murders, that police would raid his home and not only seize his person and arrest him, but also that white Elantra. And now we're learning about something they found inside of that Elantra, a shovel. And here's a look at what detectives did with that shovel after they confiscated it. This is a soil report, and it says that the soil on the shovel is consistent with soil found in the Moscow, Idaho area. The report also states that the soil was likely not from anywhere east of Moscow. This finding also excluded Pennsylvania as a likely source for the soil. So it raises a question about what that shovel could have been used for, and it brings us to the next question in our investigation. What did Bryan Kohberger bury? If he had this shovel, if he has soil on it, it's a natural question about, did he dig a hole? Here to help us with our investigation is Stuart Fillmore, retired FBI agent and journalist Howard Plum. Howard, let me start with you. Tell me about if this is the first time we're hearing about a shovel or soil.
This is the first time we're hearing about a shovel and soil, but again, it just raises questions. It doesn't give us answers. In the previous segment, we saw Olivia Gonsalves's, hard questioning of Kohberger, asking, where is the knife? Where is the hood you wore? These are questions that still remain, and we have no idea to the answers. And we saw Brett Payne talking on the previous film segment, and he was frustrated too. He just doesn't have any idea. And the fact that the prosecutor allowed this settlement to go into play before there were answers to these questions, I find very perplexing and deeply disturbing.
Stuart, when you see these details about soil and a shovel, what do you think he may have buried?
Well, I mean, I thought very early on that time span between 4:20 and 4:48, when the phone comes back on, that's when he got rid of the evidence and the clothes. I'm sorry, the knife and his clothes, and burying it was what I thought. And then seeing that there was a shovel with dirt on it just confirms that that's what happened. He buried it somewhere, and the police have, I don't doubt their thoroughness in this. They no doubt have looked every possible place they could. I don't know if they've been out there with metal detectors or not, but that knife is buried somewhere out there, and it's somewhere in that time span between 4:20 and 4:48.
We've got a vast area of green space in that area. I want to throw potentially a curveball at you, Stuart, but this is something else in that report. There's a different report. So we had the soil report. Now we're going to look at the pollen report. And it says that the findings of the exam of the pollen contents of the soil found on the shovel, the report states that the soil from the shovel contained high amounts of pine pollen and single pollen grains from plants that are not naturally distributed in Moscow, Idaho. Basswood and red maple were found in the soil recovered from the shovel. However, both are commonly planted ornamental species. Stuart, is that telling you anything? I mean, it's almost contradictory that the pollen may be from somewhere different. Is anything jumping out to you when you hear a bit of a conflict between these two reports?
No, I mean, that's, again, that's just being thorough. That's, you want as much data as you can get. And I really have no explanation for that discrepancy. But I can, because every case, no matter how hard you work it, no matter how thorough you are, there are unexplained elements to it. But that doesn't shake my thought that he buried that knife and clothes somewhere.
Howard, do you think there's anything investigative-wise that we are going to see in the future in this case? Any big reveals that are going to perhaps answer some of these questions that these family members have?
I think one day from prison, Bryan Kohberger will tell us where the knife is. He wanted to be a forensic psychologist. He will meet with other forensic psychologists, and he will tell his story one day, and we will finally get the answers to these questions, which people, or at least the prosecution, wanted to pretend weren't important when they made this plea settlement.
Stuart, you briefly mentioned this, I believe, or actually Howard may have mentioned it, but have you seen situations where in exchange for a plea deal or taking an execution off the table like we saw here, that a defendant has to reveal these details? We certainly see it when there is a body involved and prosecutors want to know where a body is. This is not that. This is evidence, but are you surprised, and are there situations where prosecutors can procure a deal like that?
Yeah, well, to be quite frank, I was a little confused in the press conference yesterday. I was impressed by how they took questions and stayed there a long time and seemingly openly answered, everything. But I was a little confused by the district attorney's explanation of why he didn't do that. I thought at one point he said, well, I couldn't do it. The law didn't allow me to do it. But then he said, but if I had done it, you couldn't trust what he says anyway. So I'm confused as, can you do it? Can you not do it? And yes, I mean, I've had direct experience, not a murder case, but an investigation where the subject pled guilty, but the prosecutors let him go without an explanation or allocution, of the facts. And it's frustrating to not know those answers. And in this case, it's to another level.
Oh, yeah. Frustrating indeed, but certainly some finality for those family members. Thank you to our panel. We have retired FBI director, or agent rather, Stuart Fillmore with us, and Howard Plum, journalist and author of When the Night Comes Falling, a requiem for the Idaho student murders. Thank you both for being on with us. And as we mentioned, it is over at this point for Bryan Kohberger. He's going to spend the rest of his life in prison. That's not in doubt. But what is in doubt is how much we will understand about these horrific crimes that he committed, how much the victims' family members will be able to learn about what happened to those 4 young lives. And if criminologists are able to study Kohberger, maybe we'll learn a little bit more about the mind of this deranged killer, but we may not like what we uncover. I'm Julia Jenaé, filling in for Vinnie Politan. We'll keep digging for answers as the investigation continues.